Hello and welcome to The Embodied Psyche. My name is Hannah Bernstein and I'm thrilled today to be interviewing Carly Weckstein. Carly is a theater director, an intimacy director, a community facilitator, and a sex educator. I've had the privilege of taking one of her workshops, which was phenomenal. And thank you, Carly, for being willing to speak with us here today.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you today.
Yay, me too. Just to get things started, I would love to hear from you how you found your way into this world of work.
Oh my gosh. Well, as you named, I do kind of four different type roles, different like hats that I put on, but I really see them all as kind of like holistic to my work. Like they feed into each other. So I started as an actor and I trained as an actor in a theater program, and I became a director at the very end of that experience and realized that that clicked for me in a different level. But a lot of that was influenced by a frustration, especially around how women who are actors were treated or put in certain boxes, and just also directors not running a space in a way that I was just like, I think I could do that better, and make people really feel like they belong and like they're seen and they're really collaborating. So that was one part of the path. And then at the same time, I was really interested in sex education. I've always been interested in directing material about human sexuality because I think it's really fascinating, and I think it's a place where our species needs a lot of healing, and I think stories are a powerful way to do that. So I was kind of being a theater director and becoming a sex educator, and then realizing that this combining that somewhat, and then this new field of intimacy direction or intimacy choreography came into the light. It's still a very new field, but it was really exciting. I could really crystallize bringing concepts and language around having consent and boundaries to directing theater, to choreographing intimate moments for actors. And then the community facilitation kind of also came out of theater. It all comes back to theater for, for me. It's my true love. But I was doing a series of shows, or two shows in rep, where I wanted there to be not a normal like talk back at the end where it's like, how did you learn all those lines? And that usual thing, but where it was more about like being in community with the actors and the audience to process some of the like intense material and to allow it to activate us beyond just like, oh, I went to the theater, I was really moved by the story, and now I'm going back to my life that's completely separate. So, and then from there, I started doing more community facilitation, especially for arts communities. So
Amazing. I love how those things all feed into one another.
yeah.
And as you're sharing about your theater background and also moving into this intimacy directing space, I'm thinking about, I've seen a couple of your shows with the Illyrian Players. And I think a while ago you did a pretty edgy take on The Taming of the Shrew that had some like gender role reversal stuff going on. Would you mind speaking to that? I was just so fascinated by it.
Yeah, sure. Oh my gosh, that was a hot second ago. The Taming of the Shrew is, I first of all, I love Shakespeare. I have like a huge Shakespeare boner. But Taming of the Shrew as like a feminist theater maker and director has always been a very interesting, problematic play to me, because it's on one level, it seemed, on the surface at least, if you play it straight as it is in a story of abuse and coercion and beyond coercion and of women being really disempowered. But so I think there's a lot of beauty and strong characters in the text. So I was really exploring how could this be a place, how could we explore this from a place where there is more agency and empowerment for the female characters? And the only thing that made sense to me was to make it a BDSM love story. And so we were exploring that through the kind of the two main relationships in that story. And it was an amazing thing to explore. It's maybe something I would come back to, like, because I have a lot of feelings. It was Oh my gosh, I don't know how many years ago, but just like in my personal growth as a human and an educator and all these things, looking back, I'm like, ooh, I would have done a bunch of things like differently, knowing what I know now or who I am now.
Oh,
But
interesting. Yeah. What would you have shifted?
oh gosh, I'm not sure like exactly the specifics, but I feel like when I did that, maybe this was like 8 years ago or something, that I like got the flavor, but I didn't like get exactly on the messaging. And I don't like art that necessarily like spoon feeds the audience. Like this is what you should think. But I think there could have been, I would have been a little even more irreverent with the text and changing it myself to have a clearer story around consent, I think is what I would do.
Yeah, I've been fascinated in an ongoing way by the way that the BDSM framework can help people be more clear about consent, but simultaneously how in that scene there are often people who kind of like are hiding their predation with a label of like, I'm a dom. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Dom phenomena.
Yes, yes. But simultaneously, you'll even hear people who are sex educators or consent educators talking about concepts like safe words that I think come straight out of the BDSM scene. So there can be really like powerfully informed consent when you're playing around with kink dynamics. And as I'm thinking about the workshop you taught, what do you call it? It was like sex magic or something.
Sex healing and magic. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Sex, healing, and magic, which are three of my favorite topics. So thanks for that. I'm remembering that there was just a lot of freedom around this idea that you could jump into exploring exactly what you desired without so much needing to investigate the root causes or pathologize it. And I really appreciated that framework because in the world that I'm a part of, you know, the psychology world, we're often looking at like, well, why would you have these impulses? Or does this come from like a distorted or unhealthy impulse? You need to fix it. And for myself, as someone who like both enjoys healing and kink, it's been really interesting to play with like, okay, at what point do I just dive in and allow something to be pleasurable? And at what point are we investigating territory that's maybe a little too edgy? How do we create a safer container? So I'm fascinated by the fact that you've been doing work to educate people around being present to these dynamics. And I guess I'm just curious, as you're moving into that space of community facilitation, intimacy direction, really helping people get dialed in about consent, what do you see as like the growth areas for that field? What are people not doing well?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, I think that the two things in the intimacy field specifically, one, I think that not everybody practices it through like a mindfully trauma informed lens, and that's something I'm really interested in exploring, and just at the beginning of kind of creating my own pedagogy or something around that with many other pieces as well. But I just think the acknowledgement that not that it's necessarily lacking, but I think there could be another layer of the acknowledgement of like how pervasive trauma is, and just that we're just make the assumption that somebody in the operating from a place that, you know, somebody in the room, you know, is a survivor of some kind of trauma, just because we all that's the world that we live in. And so I think having a mindfulness to that and bringing in, and same with actually community facilitation, and then bringing in skill, you know, having in your back pocket, being able to kind of guide people through grounding, notice somebody's energy or body language, telling you that something's might be a little off, which can be particularly hard in intimacy direction because, well, when you're working with actors, you're like, is this you or is this your character? So I'm always like, you can always pause and check in and be like, hey, I was noticing this. I just want to see, is this something that's coming from you, or is this like something that's coming from your character? And do you want to talk more about it? And then I think the other thing that I would wish for the intimacy world in particular is, it's shifting away from a scarcity mindset to really a mindset of abundance. I think there definitely is some a lot of gatekeeping in the industry, which I understand the impulse to be protective in the sense that there definitely have been people who are like, oh, intimacy director, intimacy coordinator, now I am that. And then that comes with a lot of power and responsibility that people can wield in dangerous ways if they don't actually know what they're doing. But I'm interested in intimacy work as harm reduction in this world. Like, I want everybody to have access to the basic tools and concepts, because there's more stories that we're telling that need an intimacy specialist than there are trained, certified, et cetera, intimacy specialists in the world. And so I want to empower people to choose this career. And also I want to empower actors to be able to speak up for themselves, and directors and stage managers and like designers. Like, what if everybody kind of had the basic tools in this new framework where we're prioritizing a culture of consent? So I just get very excited by, and I think the field is shifting a little bit, but by those who I find in the field who are really coming from this place of generosity and abundance. And it's just like, I want to share this info. Consent and choreography are not concepts that belong to anyone. And those have been practiced by humans for a long time.
Yeah, I agree with you immensely. I do think that everyone deserves consensual pleasure. So the more that we can popularize ways of helping people get in touch with that, the better. I think all of us have, at least those of us who like entertainment or ever read like entertainment news, have heard like horror stories about when things go wrong on set. Like, one that's very vivid in my mind is the story about like The Last Tango in Paris, and kind of like a director wanting to capture surprise. So doing something like blatantly non-consensual with an actress to get a certain expression on the face. So I'm glad that we've moved away from that kind of like auteur directors doing whatever they want style of direction. And I think more and more people are even including in their contracts that they want someone like an intimacy director on set to help them feel safe. I guess I'm just curious, as that process is going on, as that shift is happening, do you feel like there are kind of like clear standards in place for how you know when things are going right, how you know when people are comfortable?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I mean, I really, the field of intimacy for performers is really in its like toddlerhood, like, so we're still building a lot of tracks in front of the train. So there's not necessarily universal standards set, but I think something that anybody could ask themselves is just having a basic understanding of consent and how coercion is different than consent. And how a lot of times, again, with the scarcity mindset, that's how actors are trained, that it's like, oh, you're replaceable. Like, if you won't do, what I want, there's a million other people out there, and so, or if actors are trained to think, oh, if I speak up, I'm being difficult or a diva. And I think it's really about shifting the perspective. So it's like, no, if you communicate what you need to do your best work, that actually helps me direct you. That helps you get a better performance. And, there's the Last Tango in Paris story I'm also familiar with, and it's really horrific. And it's also something like actors have craft. They're craftspeople. Like, there's technique and training. So acting isn't the same as live experiencing a reality. And so like, that's so wild for, to think that not that long ago, and still some directors really see actors as like meat puppets, or like, to manipulate and to be like, oh, well, I can't get this authentic response if you're not surprised. But I think it's really important for folks who are in positions of power over actors, like directors, producers, casting directors, to remember that actors do some incredible things, that their characters and the stories they tell actually live in their bodies. Like, their bodies are their vessels. And so I think it's really important to change this narrative, where right now we kind of really glorify actors who suffer for their art. Like there's this whole putting them on a pedestal of this kind of like wild method acting behavior instead of being like, oh, hey, actors, the trauma of your character doesn't need to live in your body between rehearsals or between filming days or performances. And that like you can be like skilled with your technique and take care of your instrument, which includes your mental health, and like bring your character into your vessel and then send them away and then summon them again when you need them, instead of just like praising actors for keeping that trauma in their body, which is really a wild thing.
Yeah, I'm very curious about that. I've heard some people describe acting and psychology as kind of like two sides of the same coin. Like psychologists are kind of looking at the internal experience, like feeling things, helping people move through it internally, while actors are showing like the projection of that. But it's a very similar understanding of like the mind and the body and communication and interpersonal relationships. I guess I'm just curious, as someone who's like played around with acting in my youth, how do you shift away from the kind of feelings that come up when you're doing that kind of intense imaginative work and back into kind of like a baseline practice? How do you send the character away? Are there ways that you work with that?
Yeah, that's a super great question and an amazing practical tool. And I think it's something that, you know, you could also, people can use who aren't actors. Like, you know, you can create these same kind of tools if you're just like in this intense situation and you need to send something outside of your body for a while, or even like if you are going out to protest and there's a really intense energy and then you come home and maybe you want to make sure that doesn't live in your body. You know, it could be anything like that. But so this is called, there's a practice called de-rolling, which originally comes from theater therapy, drama therapy practices. It also can be called closure. I sometimes refer to it as ritualized closure, or I started to call it bookending, because a lot of times a director will guide an actor to get in character, but not have any process to get out. So I'm like, you got to put the other bookend on. But I like to offer like a holistic kind of de-rolling where there is a mental, intellectual aspect and that there's some kind of physical embodied aspect. So, you know, some kind of affirmation, which can be as simple as I am not the same as my character, or even, especially if your character goes through something traumatic in the story while you're acting, saying, what happened to my character is not happening to me right now. You know, or even just the message that I just said, like, I don't need to hold my character's trauma in my body all the time in order to do justice to their story. So having some kind of affirmation, I think words are very powerful. My favorite quote from one of my favorite playwrights, Susan Laurie Parks, she wrote an essay where she said, "Words are spells in our mouths." And so I think just saying those words out loud at the end of a rehearsal or performance is really powerful. And then pairing it with something physical, whether it's maybe a piece of your character's costume, like when you put on their shoes, you really invite them in. And when you take off their shoes, you're literally stepping out of their shoes, or you wipe off the red lipstick that they wear. Or there could be so many other things you could do with your body, like just stretching and dancing and like getting into some place of feeling pleasure of being present in your body can be really powerful with that affirmation, or gesturing, which this is actually something I learned from the Trauma Resource Institute's trauma resiliency model is the technique of gesturing, which could be like a self-soothing gesture. It could also be like, you know, as you're saying this kind of verbal intellectual affirmation, maybe you're taking like 2 minutes to brush the character off every part of your body. Or you could even, if you have a character who is like attacked in the story and not able to fight back, maybe part of your de-rolling is to have a gesture of pushing back. So there's so many amazing things you can do. And I think it's really important to like offer actors or guide actors to find their own that works for them. Kind of offer a buffet, like you can mix and match and see what works for you in this work. Because it's so personal depending on that specific human, that actor, and also the story they're telling and the character they're telling. I also really like visualizations. Like sometimes if I'm guiding a whole cast, I would do this even before I found out what intimacy direction was, when I'm working with a cast on charged material, I would take 5 minutes at the end of rehearsal and let everybody either like sit or lay down and kind of ground themselves, and then visualize exhaling their character out from their body. So like, your characters, maybe like you see them as this colorful mist. Maybe they're like kind of a shimmery green, or they're like a blood red or a royal purple, depending on your character or even your mood that day. But especially sometimes I would like to guide actors to like summon that and visualize breathing that in at the beginning of the time, and then really visualize releasing that and seeing it outside their body, kind of letting it float in the rehearsal space, or wherever we were in the before times. And then just trusting like that work is not gone just because it doesn't live in your body between rehearsals, and you're actually able to show up and be more present for your scene partner and with your instrument if you're not having this like pain and trauma that isn't yours live inside of you.
I love that so much. I love the ritual embodiment. I love hearing about the overlap between the techniques you're teaching actors and things that I've seen, experienced, or used in my private practice. The brushing, for instance, we do that all the time in Reiki, and just these intense visualizations remind me of how powerful the mind in conjunction with the body is to shift emotional states. So I'm really glad to hear that someone who's been practicing this in the field for years and years and years is arriving at similar techniques or pulling from similar fields to really help actors have these heightened performances. So thank you for that, Carly.
It's all connected.
It is. It's all connected. And since I have you in front of me, I find myself really wanting to pick your brain about things that have been on my mind that are a little unresolved for me in the intimacy space and the BDSM space. So like, I
don't know if I'll have a good answer, but I'll try.
Well, maybe even just raising complex questions. I feel like sometimes like new things can come out conversationally.
Yeah.
So there are some people, I'm thinking, to be frank, honestly, about a prior partner I've had who you can see palpable physical relaxation come up when something's going on that would not be relaxing for someone else. So I'll be more frank. I'm talking about things like humiliation, for example. This partner like would totally relax if I was insulting him. And then if I tried to be like kind and attentive in an intimate space, opposite would happen. He'd get tense and kind of recoil from it. So I find myself as someone who both cares about mental health and, consensual pleasure, really kind of like stuck in a limbo space between, okay, is the right thing to do to give you what your body is telling me you want, or is the right thing to do the uncomfortable emotional work of like navigating like, okay, why is it so hard for you to take in a little tenderness from me? And I guess I'm just curious, how do you manage things like that?
I mean, I think the truth or the answer or the path or whatever, as it usually does, kind of lies in the balancing of those. Like, I think, you, as you said, you saw a visceral physical response to the kind of consensual humiliation in which that was a place that helped this person access relaxation and pleasure and being present in their body. And like, what a gift to be able to give that to somebody. But I think a lot of times we don't look at the toll of like, oh, what is asking someone to do that? What is the toll that has on that person? Like, I like to say it's not just like people who are in a submissive role that need aftercare. It's dominants need aftercare just as much, because it can be really emotionally taxing to do that for someone. So I think it's really in the balance. And I think it requires having conversations like out of the play or sexual space, where, you brought up earlier about something I said in class, which I believe is that you don't necessarily have to like psychologically interrogate and psychoanalyze all your desires. For me, sometimes that I'm like, this is just bringing me farther from my pleasure. So that's not always the right choice. But, maybe there is a conversation if you're like, I want to be able as part of the relationship to give kindness and tenderness in addition to consensual humiliation. Like, maybe like we have to have this conversation, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, let's psychoanalyze exactly why that's so hard for you, but just naming like, hey, like I noticed this, I noticed a reaction, like these two very different reactions. And I would love to be able to show you both this sweet tenderness in an intimate space together and this like sexy consensual humiliation that you're really craving. But I noticed that when I give you, you know, the former, it feels like you're not like it's pressed in your body or something. And like, what is a way that we can like meet in the middle? Because it's really got to work for both people. But it's humans are very complicated.
Yeah, I appreciate the feedback though. It's interesting. I guess I didn't reflect on, the fact that I'm uncomfortable with this matters a lot.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, I definitely appreciate that. And I guess I'm also curious. So I certainly enjoy depth. I enjoy that you're a person who enjoys depth. I love these conversations. I love talking shop. Sometimes when I go out in the world and I'm like meeting new people, I'll run into a lot of people who are in the flow of the activity and the actions and not so much dialed in about the why behind things. And for them, it can be kind of uncomfortable to have like an explicit conversation about sex and consent. And I see this, my friend Philip and I have been doing mindful consent workshops lately. And I've seen this come up when people are talking about the intrigue and the mystery of new dating and a worry that, okay, if I ask permission, am I going to spoil some of the flow and the fantasy? And like, I used to be kind of dismissive of that, but honestly, I was doing that from like a kind of like privileged position of having pretty stable long-term monogamous relationships. And then when I got out in the world and I was dating again, I was like, oh, like I too, even someone who's been coaching and leading in this space, I don't want to like spoil the mood, you know? So how do you negotiate that balance between let's get really dialed in and present and also like enjoy the flow of mystery and connection?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question or quandary. And I think it's something that as a sex educator, it's one of the things I'm, you know, asked a lot or get pushback against like consent conversations from that. And I think there, you know, there's definitely a truth to, being present in the moment. But I think it's really about like, you know, if you're worried that that conversation is going to disrupt the flow, then, you know, what if you have the conversation, having the conversation beforehand? As a person who deals with a lot of anxiety, having clear expectations really helps alleviate that for me personally. And then this is actually a concept from intimacy work or language from that I'm bringing back into sex ed. They just kind of like cross-pollinate. But this idea of containers and that we build containers based on the boundaries of everyone involved. So like for actors, if we're staging a scene, we'll get everyone's boundaries. And then you know that you have freedom and consent to play and be spontaneous within that container. So I think that's a really great thing to apply to sex ed. I mean, it's a concept I've done with sex ed before, but the word like container or like building a pool or building a fence. And so just like getting clear on what is off limits and what turns somebody on, just like knowing those things. And then you're like, okay, we kind of have this like little pool that we've built and we can splash around and play in the pool and even swim all the way, you know, to the edges and the bottom and feel more confident in doing that, as opposed to being totally overwhelmed when you're like, I don't even know where the edges of this are. Yeah. And I think that, we are also we have these romanticized ideas that people are mind readers. Like if you're with the right person, quote unquote, then they will know your desires automatically, or they can like just read that from your energy and body language. And yeah, some people are really good at doing that, but even the most intuitive and even psychic people aren't perfect mind readers. And so if you don't ask somebody for what you want or tell them what your needs are or boundaries are, how can you expect them to meet that? It's like, you know, from all the rom-coms that we've seen or grown up like watching where you're like, oh, it's the like big sex scene and love, and they both are like at the same level of passion at the same time, and nobody has any communication about what they want, and then they both come at the same time and nobody touches anyone's clit, and it's extremely unrealistic. So I think it's like we have to look at, oh, we've been fed these narratives that like, oh, the right person or right situation, you'll both just know. As opposed to being like, no, it's part of your job of being a good partner is like ask for what you want and what you need. And then to hold space for the other person's wants and needs and boundaries as well.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I've also had like challenging experiences to the contrary in some respects. And I think ultimately that was a cue to me that like the relationship wasn't right fit. But I've run into things where I feel like I'm really negotiating the balance between like honest feedback and like being tactful and protective of someone's sense of esteem and their like erotic self, you know? So I feel like this comes up for almost everyone. Like we've all had like an awkward kiss, you know, especially when we're first getting sexual, like speaking up for like, oh, this works for me, this doesn't work for me. It can be really hard. And I think it can be also hard to get that critical feedback of like, hey, like this thing is painful or not as good for me as like this other thing. And on a personal level, I am often such a cerebral creature. Like I'm a creature of words. I live in my head a lot of the time.
Same.
And like sex can be this lovely space of escaping from the very like wordy mind and into somatic pleasure when it's an aligned connection, which for me usually happens over some time. But like sometimes feedback can even take me out of the mood in a certain way. So I can relate to how that could be challenging for someone. So I guess I'm just kind of curious. I feel like one of my growing edges is like, how do you give like loving feedback or sexy feedback? How do you make that like a fun part of the game?
I love this question so much. That's so beautiful. I think it's kind of just that. I was talking actually yesterday on my podcast. I have an intimacy podcast with amazing intimacy professional and James, and we were talking about what if we saw even call outs as an act of like love and generosity in terms of like, this is I kind of jump to the most extreme. But in terms of like, if somebody is just like, oh, I don't fuck with you anymore, they're not going to take the time and energy to say, hey, like this is messed up and this needs to change. That shows like, I have an investment in still being in relationship and community with you. And so I think it's a big shift. And so to kind of just bring it back to a little bit more like interpersonal, just I think we're in the midst of hopefully of a shift around how we respond to, feel about the word no. And something I teach in sex ed, in intimacy, everything is just like, we need to have a new relationship with that, because we're taught that when somebody says no, that it's so personal, that that's a rejection of us. And that we are lacking, we are bad, we are wrong. So what if we shifted that to like, oh, no, that's not about me. That's about somebody else's needs and boundaries. And like, you know, so it's really, they're giving you a gift of communication, that they care enough to tell you that they want to be in relationship with you in some way, to tell you that. And it's really hard for us to hear no. And also to say no, because there's a lot of situations where saying no is loaded or scary or like actually dangerous. So I think it's very hard for us both to hear or say no. But I love the exercise to get people to practice. You know, in the before times when we were in spaces together, though you could find a way to do it on Zoom, I have, is just like offering somebody a high five. It's like the most, and telling the group, okay, go around, offer high fives. You have to say no at least like half of the time, or, you know, if there's just one round, then you just have to say no. Just practicing in this low stakes situation, and then asking people like, what came up in your body when you said no? Like, what came up in your body when you heard no? And noticing even in this super low stakes situation, we're like, that's really difficult for most of us, including me, because we're all like socially conditioned to respond to that no in such a way. So then it can extend our empathy for people in a much higher stakes situation, whether they are being choreographed in a sex scene or whether they're actually negotiating in their sex life, that it's so much more charged and it's so much harder to say no, or name a boundary. And so that kind of can expand our empathy for what that experience is. But I hear you, and I think that there is a way to, in the moment, make feedback less clinical and scary and more fun and sexy. And I think just like exploring, using words or names that your partner finds sexy can be a helpful way of doing that. Not also shutting them down or, not giving feedback in such a harsh way, because it's so vulnerable. Sexuality is so vulnerable for all of us. So, if you really put somebody down, they will shut down and they're not going to be receptive of what you have to say. So it's just kind of finding a way to both see, give, and receive kind of constructive criticism and feedback as an act of love. And that's very challenging. I'm still growing into that, as I think most of us are, but I think it's very possible.
Yeah, as you've been sharing about this, I feel like the ideas are crystallizing more clearly in my mind. And one thing that comes up is I'm just thinking about relationship as a gift of presence, right? We're being present with one another. And I can certainly think of moments when, like long ago moments, but moments that were jarring enough that they're stuck in my brain, where I did give feedback in a way that was harsh enough that my partner totally disconnected. And it was like, I think even like 2 days of disconnection, we like lived together. And I felt deep regret and deep shame about that. And then I think kind of went back the other direction, became a little bit more withholding about clear feedback. But I think if there's an intention to stay loving and stay connected, if the feedback continues, with, of course, space for people to disengage if they need to take care of themselves, I think that's a really powerful thing. It's not like I'm giving you a mic drop and I'm turning around, It's like, we're here, we're in relationship with each other, and I want this to be better for both of us. So right. that helped clarify something for me.
And it's also kind of, which again, all of these things are personally very challenging. Like I can teach them, I can intellectualize about them, but to actually practice them is harder. So I think just giving ourselves and other people grace around that is a really big thing.
Yeah. Thank you, Carly. Since you've been doing this work for so long and in tandem with other people, I mean, overtly you're doing community facilitation, you're directing big plays, or you were before COVID. Have you seen big shifts in people as they're exposed to this kind of work?
Yeah. I mean, I think across the board, I think it can just be incredibly empowering to have tools to speak up for yourself. I definitely, in working with actors, especially around this, I've seen some big shifts, even in short amounts of time, just where folks feel like, oh, I have a word for this, or I have a phrase that I can use when I need to check in or when I need to communicate my needs. And I think that really gives more ease and allows them to be more present with their actual work instead of being hung up on like worry about their safety being violated. Or just like, even sometimes it's not that, sometimes it's just being worried about the awkwardness of the moment and just being like, that's okay. Humans are awkward. Sex is awkward. My very favorite, I think, phrase I've ever heard, or one of my favorite phrases I've ever heard in a sex ed workshop it was at a college campus, which I love in theater, in sex ed, and intimacy work. I love working with college students or young adults so much. But so there's an exercise that I do in a lot of workshops. I think in the one you took, including rewriting your sexual script, kind of as as a collective, as the group. And so it's like, what is messaging that has been like wounding that you've received, or disempowering messages about sex that you've received? And what is a new message you'd want to replace it with? So one of the replacement messages in this group was a student said, I just love to know the message or hear the message that sex can be awkward, but still cool. And I was like, I love that. That's so brilliant. The kids are all right. And just like acknowledging that. And I think that really applies to whether we're choreographing sex or having sex. Like there will be moments of awkwardness, and that's okay. It's not the end of the world. You haven't ruined this rehearsal, or you haven't ruined sex forever, or sex with this person. And just kind of giving ourselves the grace to be imperfect and be like, it's not going to be amazing 10 stars every time, but that doesn't mean it can't still be wonderful and we can't find joy and pleasure from it. I
love that message. I love that message so much, especially because I think there's a learning curve with every skill you develop. And there's certainly learning curves with social skills and touch. And I think that part of what I benefited from in my youth and early adulthood was some degree of exploration. And part of exploration was like failure. It was like trying something, like having a fantasy, thinking it'd be great in real life, and being like, oh, okay, actually, no, this doesn't work for me in real life. And I really want people to be aware of the difference between the discomfort of learning, like the discomfort of learning that we choose in tandem with someone else and, is consensually felt. But still discomfort, like there can be positive discomfort, and the discomfort of trauma inflicted on us by someone else. And I worry a little bit about this generation, like brought up mostly on screens and with so much media and messaging around, like, I worry that they have really high fantasy expectations of what sex and romance should look like. And there's not as much space for awkwardly figuring things out together.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you brought that up. That makes me think of a few different things. The first is when you're like, how do we differentiate language in intimacy direction and intimacy choreography that is often used around that is the difference between uncomfortable and unsafe, and learning what that is. And also sometimes we don't know until we run into it, and having the grace for someone to be like, oh, I thought it was one, it's actually the other, and we need to adjust accordingly. But it's like we make the best art, and we have our personal growth from the place of being uncomfortable usually. But unsafe is feeling like real harm is being done to your body, your mind, your spirit, your heart. And so I really am into promoting the message. You deserve to be able to make uncomfortable art in a safe space. Or you, I guess, translating to sex ed, you deserve to be able to have awkward, uncomfortable sexual experiences that are still safe, that are still, that are not traumatizing to you, even if they're messy and weird and uncomfortable and outside of your comfort zone. Because that's how we learn what we like or what we don't like or what we grow into.
Yeah, and I feel like the way that you articulated bookending about kind of like taking off into a character and then coming back to yourself could also be applied to these relational dynamics, where if you have that safe space for developing a container mutually, launching into the world of fantasy, but you still have that container you can return to with tools like safe words or other protective devices to trust that it's still a safe container to have those uncomfortable explorations within.
Exactly. And that's what the practice of aftercare from the BDSM and kink world is. It's like bringing everybody back to like a balanced equilibrium in this reality. So it's like we can go explore the fantasy, and then we've got to have some touchstones. Like it's like proper practice. I don't like the word proper. I don't know why I used it, but it's, to include aftercare as part of your play or your exploration in BDSM, in the same way for staging actors in intimate scenes, or not even just intimate scenes, with any kind of charged material, I really think this should be used, that we're going to have tools to give ourselves, if we're actors, the aftercare that we need to come back to who you are. Because acting is, a lot of times when we're acting, we have real feelings in a not real situation. And so we never want to invalidate, like, wow, you maybe really felt that. Or maybe you didn't. You don't have to feel it to be a good actor. Yeah, so just having this aftercare, ritualizing some kind of closure or de-rolling for yourself after you're playing. And that could be like in a personal relationship. It could be like, well, what do you need if you are, just thinking of a situation mentioned earlier, if, there's one partner who is really into this like verbal humiliation, and they're, two people are into it, they're consensual. And then, maybe part of the aftercare is, saying something different, is the tenderness, is coming back to that place of tenderness and finding a moment of that, or of expressing in some way this love and care and mutual respect that's there.
Thank you so much, Carly. In the workshop, the rewriting your script of sexual experiences, however you summarize that. So we've got some take homes already, but was there a specific exercise you might like our audience to practice with or to take away from today? Yeah,
I have a quick like addition to the sexual script writing, and then I have another brief one too. So kind of the newest evolution of that, as the Sex Healing and Magic Workshop has evolved, is reframing it around spells. So those of you who are like witchy or spiritual or whatever, I love framing it around what spells do I want to break around sexuality and what spells do I want to write in their place. So for some folks, that can be a more accessible or even more powerful portal into that exercise. So
I love that. Could you coach me through it?
Yeah, sure. And then I'm really big on like take the ritual to another level, like have a piece of paper, you could create a sigil for it, or you could just write it down and hang it somewhere you see it every day of the spell you want to rewrite. And maybe the spell you want to break, you can tear it, you can dissolve it in water, you could burn it safely. You can scribble it out into oblivion, but having some kind of physical action to release that is really powerful. And the other one that I would love to offer is something I did is a mindfulness exercise in a recent MBSR class that I took, of mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is a beautiful, wonderful thing. And so we did a mindfulness eating exercise, and highly recommend like a small piece of fruit or a small piece of like chocolate or candy. A blueberry is my go-to for this. But whatever's in season, something that you enjoy, and just take like 5 minutes for yourself. And instead of just yum, 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 putting food in face, as so many of us are just like, can easily opt into in this world of screens and busyness and all that. But to first like look at what you're going to eat, like take a moment and look at it and maybe think how you would describe it to somebody just looking at it, or maybe describe it to yourself out loud. Then feel it with your fingertips and notice how that changes how you would describe it. Like noticing the different textures. Is it like harder or softer or smoother or rougher than you thought? Or is there a surprise like spot on it? Blueberries are really interesting to do this with. And then it's so silly and I love it so much. Then you listen to it. You don't know what sound it's going to make if you don't listen, but like listen just in case your blueberry might tell you something. And then smelling it. And in each of these steps kind of describe, how would I describe it through this sensory interaction, and really taking your time, then feeling it against your lips and noticing how that changes how you experience it. And then you put it in your mouth, but don't bite down, and just notice if there's any taste. Notice if on your tongue the texture's changed or heightened or more sensitive. And then finally you slowly bite into it and notice how the texture and taste changes. And I really love offering that as a portal to sensuality and pleasure, because sometimes especially in this really, really stressful and overwhelming time that we're all living through right now, accessing pleasure or accessing sexuality in desire, all of that can feel so far removed and can feel kind of overwhelming. And so I think it's really powerful to start with a simple kind of pleasure, something that you're like, I can access a pleasurable experience in my body. And then you can go from there. Maybe the next step is like a bath or something with hot water or massage. And you can build a pathway to be in this pleasant place in your body.
I love that. Even as I'm listening to you, I'm like feeling the visceral sensations of like, yes, there is like a little nub on a blueberry. Like that would be a thing I would feel. Yeah.
Right. We won't notice if we just like throw the blueberries into our mouth. We're like, wow, it has like a little crown and everything.
Totally. Yeah, that's amazing. If you wouldn't mind going back briefly to that spell casting, I just want to understand the way that you do that. How do you rewrite a spell internally?
Okay, so maybe what is a message? It can be for you personally or just in general in the world around sexuality, a spell that you would like to break, a message that feels harmful, that has been like maybe internalized through all of the millions of people and things and media that we interact with in communities.
Something like you have to look sexy to be sexy, right?
Okay, great. So we want to break that spell. So like maybe you have 2 pieces of paper and you write that down on one of them. Then on the other one, we're like, what do we want to replace that with? How would you rewrite that into a spell that you want to embody?
Oh, yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It's just like feeling sexy is the sexiest looking thing.
Yes. It's like I don't have to look a certain way to feel sexy. If I feel, or maybe the spell is, if I feel sexy, I am sexy.
Right. Yeah. Let's take looks out of it entirely. That's much better.
Yes. If I feel sexy, I am sexy. And then it's like, write that on the other card. Then I would take like the first spell and whatever kind of feels right for you, the one you want to break, you could tear it up into a million pieces. You could burn it. You could, as I said, you could scribble it out, like just channel whatever until like it's illegible. You could bury it in dirt. You could go into the woods and like bury it. So it's kind of like some way of physically ritualizing the rejection of this. And then the other one, you could maybe, if you have like an altar, maybe you want to place those words on your altar around some other symbols that connect to feeling sexy or the message of that from you. Maybe you just want to tape it onto your bathroom mirror. So when you wash up or in the morning or at night, you read this over and over into your brain, because the spells that we're breaking, we need to break them because we've heard them so many times. And so it's kind of like this repetition, like put it somewhere where you might see it and might have a relationship in it, and let it be a seed that you plant to grow inside you.
I love that. I love the ritual. I love the repetition. And for any viewers who are skeptical about ritual magic, it doesn't need to be magic per se. The magic component comes in the fact that our brains respond to story and respond to ritual and respond to these experiences of like tactile and emotional significance. And then in repeating those patterns, we change the neural pathways in our brains, which is magic, but it's also very practical magic.
And it's also science. It's it's all one. And it's, I once had a friend who's more religious and just asking me about like, what do you mean by a spell or whatever, And so I explained to her, and then she's like, oh, it's like, for me, it's just like a prayer. And I'm like, yeah. So it's kind of whatever you want to call it, whether it's a spell, a prayer, an affirmation, a way to rewrite your neural pathways. It can be any of those things. It's kind of like whatever works for you is where the magic is.
I really feel like you and I, for whatever reason, are like just fascinated by similar things. And we've explored them in different avenues, but like, I'm just like, I'm feeling you.
That's no, same. Would love to continue this conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carly. This has been such an illuminating conversation. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Oh my gosh, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me.
You're so welcome.